I'll never forget the Christmas when everything finally clicked. I was about 10, and while the December air outside was freezing, inside, the house was glowing with holiday lights and decorations. My mom was in her element, orchestrating every detail of the dinner, while my dad stood like some kind of general, giving orders with his usual serious expression. My sisters, as always, were the center of attention, dressed in brand new, expensive outfits, twirling in front of the Christmas tree, showing off to anyone who would look. Me, I was told to wear whatever I had lying around. But the real blow came with the gifts. Not that I was expecting anything amazing. I had long since realized that my parents played favorites. My older sister got a sleek, top-of-the-line bicycle, the kind that probably cost a fortune. My younger sister unwrapped a brand new gaming console, loaded with accessories she probably wouldn't even use. And then it was my turn. My mother handed me a tiny package, her smile awkward, like she knew what was coming. I tore off the wrapping paper, hoping, just for a second, that maybe, just maybe, this year would be different. But no. Inside was a toothbrush. Not even an electric one. I stared at it, then at them, waiting for someone to laugh, to tell me this was some kind of joke. But nothing. My mother's weak smile stayed frozen in place, my sisters burst out laughing, and my father didn't even glance up from his plate. That night, sitting alone in my room, holding that damn toothbrush, something inside me shifted. It was like a switch flipped. No matter what I did, no matter how hard I tried, I would always be an afterthought in this family. It wasn't about money. They had plenty of that. My father ran a successful business, and my mother dedicated herself to keeping up the illusion of a perfect household. But that illusion never included me. Anytime there was a family event, my sisters were introduced first, center stage, the shining stars, while I was barely acknowledged, just part of the background. The only people who seemed to notice my absence were my grandparents. They were the only reason I didn't lose my mind in that house. Whenever I could, I spent weekends with them. My grandmother always made my favorite meals, and my grandfather taught me about life, how to fix things, how to stand my ground, how to keep going even when the world seemed determined to push me down. "You're different," he used to tell me, "and that's not a bad thing." I never fully understood what he meant at the time, but those words stuck with me. My grandparents never openly said they saw the way I was treated, but I knew. My grandmother's sharp glances at my mother whenever she ignored me, my grandfather's quiet but firm words. Time has a way of setting things right. It was all there, even if they didn't spell it out. While my sisters basked in endless attention and privileges, I became the observer, the one who saw and remembered everything. I stopped expecting anything from my parents, stopped trying to impress them, because I knew it wouldn't change a thing. But my grandparents made me feel like I was worth something, like I had value, even when my own parents acted like I was just extra space in the house. That bond with them? It kept me sane. And though I didn't know it yet, the strength they gave me would be what saved me in the end, because one day, my parents' perfect world would start crumbling, and I'd be the only one left standing. For years, I settled into my role as the invisible child. I learned to keep my expectations low, to not hope for much, not even for the little things. My sisters remained the royalty of the house, while I was more like a servant, existing only to follow the rules and stay out of the way. The irony? My parents weren't even bad people, at least not in the traditional sense. To outsiders, we looked like the picture-perfect family. My mother was always hosting events, making sure everything looked flawless, while my father carried himself like the head of a well-run household. But behind closed doors, their favoritism was impossible to ignore. Everything revolved around my sisters. It didn't matter what I did. If I got straight A's, all I got was a half-hearted good job. If I accomplished something at school, it wasn't even worth mentioning at dinner. The conversation was always about them. Always. The only place where I felt like I actually mattered was at my grandparents' house. They were my escape. My grandfather, with his quiet strength and wisdom, always made me feel like I could take on anything. Don't ever let anyone tell you what you're worth, he'd say whenever he saw that defeated look in my eyes. And my grandmother? She was pure comfort. Whether it was through a warm meal or just one of her long, steady hugs, she had a way of making everything feel okay, even when it wasn't. One day, during one of those visits, my grandfather took me outside to his garden. He stood there, watering his plants, and said something I'd never forget. Life has a funny way of balancing itself out. It might seem unfair now, like some people have everything while others get nothing. But give it time. The world always finds a way to even the score. At the time, I didn't fully grasp what he was saying, but I held on to those words like they were gold. Back at home, nothing changed. My sisters got everything they wanted: extravagant birthdays, piles of expensive gifts, luxury vacations. When my younger sister turned 18, she got a brand new car. When I turned 18, a pair of shoes. I didn't even bother getting upset. What was the point? Complaining wouldn't change a thing. Instead, I shifted my focus. I studied harder. I worked. I saved. I started laying the groundwork for a future that had nothing to do with them. I don't think my parents ever expected much from me. If anything, they probably assumed I'd always be in my sister's shadow, never making anything of myself. They had no idea I was building something real, something far beyond their shallow little world of appearances. And yet, there was one thing I couldn't ignore: the growing tension between my grandparents and the rest of my family. My grandparents had always tried to treat everyone fairly, but I could see it, the way their patience with my parents was wearing thin. My grandfather, usually a man of few words, didn't even bother hiding his frustration anymore. I don't know how anyone can be so blind to what's right in front of them, I overheard him say one day, shaking his head. I didn't think much of it at the time, but what I didn't realize was that my grandparents were already making moves, big ones. And when the time came, the whole dynamic of our family would be flipped on its head. It started small, almost unnoticeable. But looking back, the signs were everywhere. My grandparents, who had once been the glue that held the family together, started distancing themselves from my parents and sisters. Family gatherings that used to feel like lively celebrations became quiet, tense affairs. My grandfather stopped engaging in conversations as much. My grandmother, still warm but sharper now, started making comments that clearly made my parents uncomfortable. I remember one particular lunch. We were all at their house, gathered around the long wooden dining table. The sun was shining outside, making everything look deceptively perfect. My mom was gushing about my older sister's upcoming wedding, my dad chiming in with his usual proud remarks. My sisters were, of course, dominating the conversation, making sure everyone knew just how important their lives were. And my grandparents? They just sat there watching, like they knew something the rest of us didn't. The conversation at the table was the usual nonsense. My sisters going on about their social lives, their shopping lists, and their future plans, as if they were the only people in the world. I sat there, quiet as always, focusing on my plate, trying to stay invisible. But my grandfather? He wasn't having it. Out of nowhere, he put his fork down with a sharp clank and, in a tone so calm it somehow made the air heavier, asked, "And what about you, son? How are your plans coming along?" Every pair of eyes in the room snapped to me. The shift was immediate. I wasn't used to being the center of attention, especially not in a house where my words never seemed to matter. I barely had time to open my mouth before my mother cut in with her usual dismissive tone. "Oh, you know how he is, always so reserved. I'm sure everything's just fine, right?" My sisters giggled. My father didn't even bother looking up from his phone. But my grandfather? He wasn't letting it slide. "Reserved doesn't mean invisible. Maybe we should start paying attention to what isn't being said, instead of filling every moment with our own voices." Silence. Thick, heavy silence. My mother glanced away, visibly uncomfortable. My father kept his eyes glued to his phone like it was the most interesting thing in the world. That was the moment I realized my grandfather had had enough. He was done watching the way I was constantly sidelined. From that day on, something shifted. My grandparents, who had always been my safe space, started to become even more involved in my life. My grandfather called me into his office more often, and our conversations changed. They weren't just about fixing things or passing the time anymore. He started talking about his life, his business, and the lessons that actually mattered. He told me success wasn't about what you had, but what you did with it. One afternoon, as I helped my grandmother in the garden, she suddenly stopped, took my hand, and looked at me with an expression I didn't quite understand. "You know you're special, right?" she said softly. "Stronger than you think. I know it might not feel like it now, but trust me, good things come to those who work hard and don't lose faith." That sentence burned itself into my memory, like she knew something I didn't. And she did. Because while my home life remained the same, my sisters basking in endless attention and luxury while I stayed an afterthought, my grandparents were making moves behind the scenes. I had no clue what they were planning. Then came the day that changed everything. It was supposed to be just another routine family gathering at my grandparents' house. Nothing unusual. But as we finished dinner, my grandfather stood up, his expression calm, his tone serious. "We've made some important decisions," he announced. The room fell dead silent. My parents and sisters looked at him, intrigued, but there was something else in the air. A tension. A shift. I couldn't explain it, but I felt it in my bones. This wasn't just some casual announcement. "It's time to talk about the future," he continued. And just like that, everything changed. The atmosphere in the room was different now. My sisters, who were so used to every conversation revolving around them, looked suddenly unsure. My parents? My mother let out a nervous little laugh, trying to keep things light. "Well, Dad," she said, forcing a smile, "we all know how much you care about keeping the family together. Isn't that what matters most?" My grandfather didn't smile back. "A united family means nothing without respect," he said firmly, "without real values to sustain it." The words hit like a hammer. My mother's smile faltered. My sisters exchanged uneasy glances. My father, predictably, acted like he was suddenly fascinated by the tablecloth. Me? I felt like my grandfather was speaking directly to me, like there was some message in his words that only I was supposed to understand. Then he got to the point. "For years," he said, "I've been considering how to handle our estate. How to ensure that what we've built is protected and used wisely." The tension in the room grew thicker. I saw the anticipation on my sisters' faces. They knew they were the obvious choices. After all, they were the golden children, the ones who had always been showered with everything they wanted. Then my grandfather continued. "What we decided," he said, his voice steady, "is that the legacy we built must go to someone who values it, someone who will protect it, someone who will use it for good." And then he turned to me. My heart stopped. The room froze. I felt the weight of every single person's gaze drilling into me. Disbelief. Confusion. In some cases, outright contempt. Before I could even process what was happening, my grandfather kept going. That's why, after much thought, we've decided that when the time comes, he will be the one to take control of our properties and resources. The explosion was instant. My mother gasped, eyes wide in shock. My older sister actually choked on her coffee. What? She practically shrieked, her voice laced with outrage. That doesn't make any sense. We've always been the ones closest to you. We visit you all the time. We take care of all the details. My grandfather raised a hand, silencing her with just a look. You really believe that? He asked, his voice calm, but sharp enough to cut. Because what I've seen is years of entitlement. Years of looking down on someone who has done nothing but stay true to himself. Someone who never asked for recognition, but who has more integrity than any of you. My sisters started arguing, their voices growing more frantic. My mother jumped in, insisting this was unfair and that my grandfather had to reconsider. But he didn't. His voice didn't waver. The decision is made, he said with finality. This isn't up for debate. Then my grandmother spoke. Her voice was gentle, but just as firm. This isn't about dividing the family, she said, though I understand why some of you might see it that way. This is about recognizing the person who has shown humility, hard work, and a pure heart. And he, she looked at me, has shown all of that and more. I felt like the world had stopped. On one hand, I was stunned. I never expected this. On the other, for the first time in my life, I felt seen. I felt validated. Like someone had finally acknowledged all the years I had been ignored, pushed aside, treated like I didn't matter. But at the same time, I could feel the hatred in my sister's stares, the resentment burning in my mother's eyes. The rest of the evening was a complete disaster. Shouting, arguing, accusations flying. It was chaos, and I could barely keep up with any of it. Eventually, I retreated to my room at my grandparents' house, needing some air, some space, something to ground me. That's when my grandfather came in. He sat down next to me, rested a hand on my shoulder, and spoke. I know this won't be easy, he said, his voice calm, steady. But we believe in you. We trust you. And though this might feel like a burden now, one day, you'll understand, it's an opportunity. And it's yours to make the most of. I didn't know what to say. My mind was still spinning. All I knew was that nothing would ever be the same again. That dinner was anything but peaceful. My mother was fuming, barely able to look at me, as if acknowledging my existence would make it all real. My sisters? They weren't even pretending. The passive-aggressive comments started flying. Hope you don't forget where you came from once you're swimming in money. My older sister spat, her voice dripping with venom. Guess you won't have time for us now, the younger one added, crossing her arms. Too busy being important, right? I clenched my jaw, but didn't take the bait. For the first time, I wasn't playing their game. I wasn't scrambling to earn their approval or bending to my mother's guilt trips. But I had no idea just how far they were willing to go. That night, as I was heading to bed, I heard hushed voices downstairs. My sisters were in the living room, arguing. Curiosity got the best of me, and I stopped on the stairs to listen. This can't just happen, my older sister hissed. Our whole lives, we were told we'd inherit everything. And now they're giving it to him? They're punishing us, the younger one whispered back. But we can't let it end like this. There was a pause, and then the words that made my stomach drop. Maybe if we make him look bad, they'll change their minds. I gripped the railing, stunned. They were actually plotting against me, trying to manipulate our grandparents into reversing their decision. Any hope I had that this was just anger talking, that they'd get over it, was gone. It wasn't about family or fairness or love. It was about control. The next morning, my grandfather called me into his office. The moment I closed the door, he got straight to the point. "I know this isn't easy for you," he said, his voice steady. "But listen carefully. The real test isn't what you're given. It's how you handle the people who want to take it away." I swallowed hard, nodding. "Your sisters won't stop," he warned. "And neither will your mother. But you have the strength to face whatever's coming." That conversation stayed with me, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. My sister started spreading rumors, whispering to extended family that I had manipulated our grandparents, that I was some master schemer who had guilt-tripped them into favoring me. And my mother? She took it to another level. She arranged a lunch with relatives without telling me, and right in the middle of it, she put on the performance of a lifetime. "It's such a shame," she sighed dramatically, making sure everyone heard, "that such an important decision was influenced by selfish interests." I snapped. "Selfish?" I shot back, my voice cutting through the room. "All my life, I've gotten crumbs while you've handed them everything without question. And now I'm the manipulative one? Maybe you should take a long look in the mirror and ask yourselves why the grandparents trust me more than you." Silence. Absolute silence. No one had expected me to fight back. For once, I wasn't the quiet one. I wasn't the kid fading into the background while my family controlled the room. I saw it in their faces, shock, discomfort. But something else happened too. Over the next few days, a shift began. Some relatives, who had always seemed distant, started reaching out. "You know," my uncle told me one evening, "we've always admired how dedicated you've been to your grandparents. Don't let the backlash get to you. You're doing the right thing." Not everyone in the family was against me. Not everyone shared my sister's entitlement. But the real moment of reckoning came when my grandparents called for a family meeting. A formal one. A moment to settle things once and for all. I stood in the living room as my grandfather addressed everyone. "This inheritance," he said, his voice calm but firm, "isn't a prize. It isn't a gift. It's a responsibility." He explained how he had made his decision, not out of favoritism, but out of trust. My sisters tried to interrupt, but my grandmother cut them off with a single look, a rare moment of quiet authority. "We've watched all of you for years," she said, "and what we see in him is integrity. Something we can't say about everyone in this room." The truth landed like a hammer. My sisters sat stiffly, their faces frozen in barely concealed fury. My mother? She looked like she'd been physically slapped. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't apologizing. I wasn't justifying. I wasn't begging for a seat at the table. I belonged here. Later that night, I sat outside in my grandparents' garden, watching the sunset. I had never felt this kind of peace before. I knew the war wasn't over. My sister's resentment wouldn't disappear overnight. My mother wouldn't just accept this quietly. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid of them. I wasn't the invisible son anymore. I had a voice. I had a future. And I was ready for whatever came next. But my sisters? They weren't finished yet. A few days later, I got the news. They had contacted a lawyer. They were looking for a way to challenge my grandparents' decision. "It's unfair," they argued. "This was done behind our backs." When I found out, I didn't know whether to laugh or feel sorry for them. Did they really think this was about money? About assets? No. Their problem was control. I wasn't about to sit back and let them tear everything apart, though. I went straight to my grandparents and told them what was happening. My grandfather, ever the stoic man, barely blinked. "Let them try," he said simply. "The truth always comes out." and what we've decided will not change. I should have felt reassured, but something still nagged at me. I didn't want this to turn into a never-ending legal battle with my own family. So I decided to face them head-on. I arranged a meeting at a coffee shop, neutral ground. When they arrived, they were still holding on to their usual arrogance, their air of superiority. I made sure they understood one thing right away. You can try whatever you want, I told them, looking them straight in the eye. But I'm not playing your game. They glanced at each other, searching for a response. For once, they had nothing. But my older sister, always the smooth talker, took one last shot. This isn't just about money, she said, leaning forward. It's about respect. You've never had any. You were just a shadow in this family. And now, suddenly, you're the chosen one. It doesn't make sense. Her words should have cut. A year ago, they probably would have. But this time, I didn't flinch. You're right, I said, keeping my voice calm. I was never the favorite. I never had anything handed to me. Maybe that's why I'm here now. Because I earned it. Because I don't need to manipulate people to get what I want. If you want to fight this, go ahead. But I'm not wasting my time or my peace. I stood up and walked out, leaving them sitting there. And for the first time in my life, I felt free. My mother, in her usual dramatic tone, tried one last time. Do you really not care what you're doing to your sisters? I didn't hesitate. No, Mom. They did it to themselves. That was the end of it. Over time, the chaos died down. My sisters eventually gave up on their legal battle, though the resentment never faded. Every time we crossed paths at family gatherings, I could feel it, the bitterness in their eyes, the tension in the air. My mother, still distant, seemed to accept that things weren't going to change. And my grandparents? Even though they were sad about how everything had played out, they never wavered. We made the right decision, they reminded me again and again. The biggest surprise came months later. My aunt, someone I had never been particularly close to, called me out of nowhere. I always knew you were different, she said. And seeing how you handled all of this, I'm convinced your grandparents made the best choice. Don't let them drag you down. Hearing that meant more than I expected. Little by little, I started using what I had inherited, not just to benefit myself, but to create something meaningful. I invested in projects that reflected everything my grandparents had taught me: hard work, humility, and the importance of lifting others up. I started a foundation in their honor, a program dedicated to helping talented young people who didn't have the resources to chase their dreams. Education, career guidance, scholarships, the kind of opportunities that could change lives. Seeing it grow, watching the impact it had, knowing that I was giving others the chances I never had, that was worth more than any inheritance. Looking back now, I see that this was never about money. It was never about ownership or power. This was about breaking a cycle, a toxic family dynamic that had lasted for generations. I didn't become who I am because of what I was given. I became who I am because of how I chose to handle what came with it. And my mother? My sisters? Our relationship will never be the same. And that's okay. I've made peace with it. Because in the end, the most valuable thing my grandparents left me wasn't wealth. It was the strength to stand my ground, even when the whole world seemed against me.